They laughed, right there on the porch, champagne glasses in hand. My dad said, "Claire's getting a degree in storytelling. Maybe she'll write our family drama one day." They all chuckled, except me. I stood there holding my cap and gown, wondering how many more times I'd have to swallow the shame. I wasn't invited to the graduation dinner. Again. I almost skipped the ceremony. But when the dean stepped up and read my name first, everything froze. The cameras, the whispers, the clapping. For a moment, I wasn't just the forgotten child. I was the storm they didn't see coming. I was 11 when I noticed the meals. Ethan got steak, medium rare, just how he liked it. I got boiled cabbage and rice. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Maybe I missed the good stuff by coming home late from tutoring. But it kept happening. Every dinner, every celebration. Ethan was the king of the house and I was... what? A guest? When I got accepted to Harvard, I thought, finally, this was it. This would be the moment they saw me. But instead, my mother's first words were, "Why would you waste such a good school on a useless major?" I stood there, letter in hand, trembling. "Humanities?" she continued. "You think reading poems is a career?" My father didn't even look up from his phone. They told relatives I was studying creative crying. At every family gathering, I became the punchline. Meanwhile, Ethan, business major, future CEO, golden boy, received applause just for existing. He failed a class once. They called it a Brauer creative setback. I aced a thesis. They called it a hobby gone too far. One New Year's dinner, I overheard my mother whisper to my aunt in Vietnamese, "Claire doesn't need college. She just needs to learn how to cook and find a husband." I wasn't supposed to understand, but I did. Every word landed like glass inside my chest. I pushed my chair back, quietly, before anyone noticed the tears. They forgot my birthday twice, left me outside in the snow once when I got back late from class. My fingers turned purple before Ethan finally opened the door and said, "Why didn't you just call someone else?" I laughed that night, hysterically, in the dark hallway, alone. One evening I came home early from the library and saw something strange. My mother was in the garage, burning old photos. Most were random, but one caught my eye. A little girl who looked uncannily like me, only with a different woman. My mother froze when she saw me. "Go inside," she said sharply. I didn't move. "Now!" Her eyes were steel. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the image. That girl, that woman, that fire. I began journaling, obsessively. Each entry a quiet scream on paper. I wrote things I couldn't say aloud. What if I'm not theirs? Would someone else have loved me better? I wrote like I was trying to dig my way out of an invisible hole. Curiosity became compulsion. I started searching the house when no one was home. I knew it was wrong, but I needed answers. In the back of my mother's closet, behind a broken shoe rack, I found it. A dusty folder, labeled with my name. Inside, a hospital letter dated 2002. The patient name didn't match my mother's. I sat on the floor, hands trembling. The name on the paper was someone else, a name I didn't recognize. I flipped through the file. More letters, a photo, faded, water-stained, of that same woman from the garage. I looked into her eyes, into mine. It hit like a thunderclap. I wasn't their biological daughter, I was adopted, and they never told me. I didn't cry, not right away. I just sat there, holding this truth like a lit match. Every cold dinner, every forgotten birthday, every smirk. They made sense now, or at least They had a shape. That night I started recording audio journals. I didn't know what I'd do with them. Maybe a book, maybe nothing. But I needed proof, evidence, my story, in my words. Because if no one else would see me, I had to make myself seen. One afternoon, while editing a recording, I caught something. In the background, faint, my mother's voice, frustrated, whispering, "I didn't ask for this. I'm just repaying a debt. That girl was never supposed to stay." The recorder slipped from my hand. I couldn't breathe. I walked out into the snow with no coat, no gloves. I walked until the cold became numbness, until I felt nothing. But I didn't collapse. I didn't scream. I walked back home, quietly, pulled out my notebook, and wrote, "I may have been born from someone else's body, but this life, this pain, this fight, this fire, is mine." I zipped up my jacket, picked up my bike, and rode toward the campus through the thick snow. My eyes were wet, but my spine was straight, and for the first time, I wasn't riding to escape. I was riding to begin. Harvard's campus buzzed with ambition, elbowed students chasing law degrees, business minors counting internships. I walked through them like a ghost. No one knew I was living a double life. I had quietly enrolled in a second concentration, artificial intelligence and ethics. On paper, I was still just a humanities major. At night, I lived in code and case studies. By day, I read Kafka and Morrison. By night, I studied moral algorithms. No one knew. Not my classmates. Certainly not my family. They didn't deserve to. I paid for this second major myself, writing essays for international students, tutoring kids whose parents paid 3 figures an hour. I survived on energy drinks, vending machine snacks, and 5 hours of sleep. One night, after a particularly vicious argument with my father over my waste of time studies, I opened a new browser tab. I started writing. It wasn't an essay or thesis. It was a blog post, titled, "When You're the Invisible Child in a Perfect Family." I published it anonymously. By morning, it had over 3,000 views. That post became the first of many. Stories poured out of me like old rain. I wrote about the gaslighting, the favoritism, the emotional starvation that doesn't leave bruises. And apparently, I wasn't alone. Hundreds commented, thousands followed. It went viral in college circles. Students whispered in libraries, "Have you read her?" Some called me brave, others called me broken. But I kept writing. Then came the email. Subject, "Let's talk." It was from Professor Elias Kwan, the department chair for AI ethics, a legend on campus. I froze. Had he figured out I was the author? I braced myself for consequences. Instead, he wrote, "I've read your work, both the academic and the honest kind. If you're interested, there's a private grant I manage. No strings attached." I stared at the screen in disbelief. Someone saw me, really saw me, for who I was, not who I was expected to be. That night, I cried in the stairwell of my dorm. Not because I was hurt, but because I finally felt real. But secrets have a shelf life. One afternoon, I came home and found my father in the living room, phone in hand, face twisted with fury. He held up the screen. My blog. "You lied to us," he spat. "Writing about this family like we're monsters. You two-faced little snake." My mother stood behind him, silent. "You think Harvard makes you better than us? We fed you, clothed you. And this is how you repay us." I opened my mouth, but no words came. Only breath. He threw my laptop across the room. "Get out." Later that week, I sat in the corner of the old university library. I found a letter tucked between 2 books, written in the slanted script of a girl who was once a sophomore here. She had taken her life after her parents forced her to switch majors. She wrote, "I wanted to be an artist, but they wanted an engineer. I thought if I died, maybe they'd finally see me." I folded the letter slowly. My fingers trembled. She never got the chance to fight, but I was still here. So I fought harder. I kept writing, studying, presenting, teaching undergrads, until my body gave out. It was during a conference, mid-presentation, when my throat closed up. No voice, just air. I tried to speak. Nothing. The world tilted. They called it acute stress laryngitis. Doctor's orders, 2 weeks complete vocal rest. At home, I lay curled on the couch, barely breathing. My phone buzzed. A family group chat. Photos of Ethan holding a plastic trophy. "So proud of our boy," the caption read. They'd sent him flowers. They didn't know I'd collapsed. I laughed. Then I cried. Then I stopped doing both. 2 days later, I opened my inbox to find a forwarded email. My former best friend had written to my parents. She accused me of using fake trauma for attention, said I was tarnishing my family's image, said she couldn't stay silent anymore. That was the final straw. My parents didn't ask questions. They gave me 48 hours to leave. I packed a small bag, 1 hoodie, 2 books, a notebook, and the only thing that mattered, a necklace with a tiny sea charm. The last thing left from my birth mother. At a cheap Airbnb near campus, I finally opened the notebook. In the last pages was a folded sheet, familiar handwriting, slanted, feminine. It said, "Finish this for me. Your voice is stronger than mine ever was." I traced the letters with my thumb. My chest ached. This was her story. Now it was mine too. I clicked on a blank document. Title, Inheritance. And I began to write. I sat on the floor of that rented room, my laptop balancing on a suitcase. All I had was silence, a broken past, and one thought circling like a hawk. If no one gives me a place, I'll carve it out myself. That night, I uploaded the first episode of a podcast I titled, Not the Favorite Child. I didn't try to sound polished. I didn't hide my cracks. I spoke like I was reading a letter to someone who never listened. My voice still raspy from the laryngitis. I whispered into the mic about invisible scars, about feeling erased inside your own family portrait. By morning, it had 400 plays. By the end of the week, 40,000. Messages flooded in. Other students, older siblings, strangers halfway across the world, all saying the same thing. This is my story, too. Every Tuesday night, I'd sit in that same corner and record. I talked about pretending to be okay, about birthdays no one remembered, about the ache of being tolerated instead of loved. The podcast became a movement. Student groups at other colleges began forming under the same name. A community was building itself around truth, raw, unfiltered, real. One afternoon, as I finished editing an episode, an email pinged. Subject, "Your voice belongs in print." It was from a mid-sized publisher in New York. They wanted to turn my story into a book, not just my blogs or the podcast scripts. My story. Unfiltered. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. I typed 3 words before I could stop myself. Tell me more. Later that month, I was invited to a panel about the emotional impact of academic pressure. I almost declined, but something pulled me there. When I walked into the room, I saw him, Professor Elias Kwan. He smiled when our eyes met. "Claire Hudson," he said. "You're not as invisible as you think." After the session, he asked to speak privately. We sat beneath a giant painting of the Harvard crest. He pulled out an old yearbook and turned it to a page marked with a worn ribbon. There she was, my birth mother. Smiling, arms slung around a younger Elias. "She was brilliant," he said softly. "Poetic, sharp, stubborn as hell. You have her fire." I couldn't speak. I just nodded. "Before she passed, she left something for you. I kept it all these years, not knowing when or if I'd get to pass it on." He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a faded photo of her holding a newborn. Me. On the back, she had written, "Claire, don't let the world quiet you." The next morning, I boarded a train alone and traveled 2 hours to a cemetery, tucked behind a church no one visited anymore. I found her grave. Simple, almost forgotten. I sat beside it for hours, unsure what to say. Then I whispered, "I'm still here, Mom, and I'm not invisible." The wind rustled like a reply. A week later, I moved into a small studio on the edge of campus. No roommates, no memories. Just peace. I bought a folding table, strung fairy lights, and made it my headquarters. I accepted an invitation to give a TED Talk. Not under my name, but under my podcast alias. I spoke about shame, erasure, and reclaiming identity. When the video went live, it hit 1 million views in 3 days. I wasn't anonymous anymore. I founded a group called The Unseen Circle, a safe space for students who, like me, grew up being emotionally sidelined. We met every Friday. We shared stories. We cried. We laughed in the dark. Some brought poems. Others just brought silence. That was enough. Each member carried invisible scars. We didn't compare them. We just held them together. Months passed, but something in me had shifted. I no longer wrote to be heard. I wrote to heal. Then came the letter, handwritten. No return address. It was from my father. Inside was one sentence. "If you walk that stage, you are no longer our daughter." No greeting, no love, just a warning. It should have hurt, but it didn't. Not the way it used to. I folded the letter, placed it in the drawer with my birth mother's photo, and closed it gently. They had erased me once. They wouldn't do it again. The morning of graduation was humid, sky stained with the kind of gray that couldn't decide whether to bless or ruin the day. My robe felt heavier than it should have, and my name card was curled at the corners from the sweat in my palms. Dean Salinger stood tall at the podium, flipping through his folder. His eyes scanned the crowd of parents, cameras, and caps ready to fly. Then he cleared his throat. "Claire Hudson, first in class, dual concentration in humanities and ethics in technology, summa cum laude, Impact Creator Award recipient." It was silent for a second, just long enough for me to feel the universe blink. Then the applause came, a thunderstorm of hands. I stood, heart punching my ribs, and walked toward the stage. My eyes flicked across the crowd, but there was no familiar face, no parents, no Ethan. Just strangers clapping for someone they'd never fed, never held, never heard cry in a locked bedroom. I reached the podium, shook the dean's hand, and took the mic. I had practiced this speech 100 times, rewritten it 10 more. But standing there with the crowd settling, my voice came out softer than I'd planned. When you grow up invisible, you either learn to vanish or fight to exist. Before I could go further, I saw movement at the back of the ceremony space. My parents, walking toward the stage, not clapping, not smiling. Behind them, in a gray suit and a face like stone, was their lawyer. I blinked. My breath caught mid-sentence. I looked back at the crowd. Some were confused, others whispering, phones raised. My father spoke first, loud enough to cut through the air. "You do not have permission to exploit this family." My mother said nothing, just stood stiff, lips pressed into a thin line. The lawyer handed a manila envelope to the stage usher. She passed it to me with trembling fingers. Inside, a cease and desist order. They were demanding I remove every blog post, every podcast episode, every mention of our family name. I could have broken. My knees could have buckled. But instead I reached into my gown, pulled out the old notebook, the one my birth mother left me, and opened to a folded page. "This," I said, voice firm, "is my inheritance." I unfolded the letter slowly, fingers steady, and read, "Claire, you are light, even if raised in shadows. You are not their silence. You are not their shame. You are mine. Speak." The crowd didn't move for a second. Then someone began to clap, then another, and another, until everyone was on their feet. Dean Salinger stepped forward, placed a hand on my shoulder, and whispered, "Finish it." So I did. I spoke of pain, of rejection, of finding home within yourself when no one offers one, of building identity, not through blood, but truth. When I finished, I looked up. My parents were already walking away. Not a glance back. I didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because something bigger had just taken its place. That night, I returned to my studio apartment and found my inbox flooded. The story had gone viral. Clips from the ceremony were already online. Hashtags trended. A Claire Hudson speech and not the favorite child. But one email stood out. It was from the legal office managing the family trust. Effective immediately, all remaining tuition support and housing stipends had been revoked. They were cutting me off entirely. I sat on the floor, screen lighting my face, and exhaled. Not from panic, not from fear, but relief. Finally, they'd made it official. I was no longer theirs. The next few weeks were hard. Rent loomed, bills collected. But then came something unexpected. A GoFundMe, started by a student from Stanford I had never met, titled, "Let's Keep Claire's Voice Alive." Within 48 hours, it had over $75,000. I broke down, not from defeat, but from the overwhelming realization that I was no longer shouting into a void. I was part of a chorus now. Donations poured in from people who had read my blog, listened to my podcast, watched the speech. Strangers who said they saw themselves in me. People who'd felt alone for so long, they forgot what it felt like to be heard. One message simply read, "Thank you for surviving, so I didn't feel like a ghost." I took a break. A real one. No speeches, no posts, no proving. I rode my bike through the city, past places that once hurt. My old street. The park where my dad taught Ethan to ride but never offered me a turn. The church we used to pretend at being perfect inside. I didn't stop to cry. I didn't rage. I just pedaled. Wind in my face, freedom in my lungs, gratitude in my chest. And then, just as I thought this chapter might quietly close, I got another email. This time, from the Harvard English department. They were offering me a temporary lecturer position. Course title, Writing for Healing. I stared at the subject line, then read the body 3 times before I believed it. They wanted me to teach, not because I fit a mold, but because I had shattered one. I never believed in therapy. Not because I thought it was weak, but because I had spent so long pretending I didn't need to be saved. But sitting across from Dr. Salas in a sunlit office that smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish, I realized I had run out of places to store the pain. It was leaking, quietly, into everything. She didn't ask what I did or where I studied. She simply said, "Tell me what it's like to carry a house that never felt like home." I broke. For weeks I came every Thursday, and we unspooled my knots, one silent dismissal, one skipped birthday, one shouted insult at a time. I learned that healing wasn't loud. It wasn't poetic. It was messy, uneven, sometimes infuriatingly slow. But it was mine. The biggest shift came when Dr. Salas asked, "Why do you still crave their approval?" I sat there, blinking, as if the question itself was offensive. But it wasn't. It was true. That night, I wrote in my journal, "The love I never got doesn't define my worth. The silence I endured doesn't discredit my voice." Something shifted after that. I didn't stop missing the idea of parents, but I stopped needing them to be those parents. Then came the unexpected. It was after a guest lecture. Students were filing out and I was packing up my laptop when I saw her standing in the doorway. Haley, my best friend from high school, the one who sent that email to my parents, the betrayal that kicked me out of the house. She looked smaller, not physically, but spiritually, like someone who had been burning from the inside for years. "I've been following everything," she said, voice quiet. "I didn't come here to fight. I'm sorry." I didn't say anything. "I wasn't okay," she added. "Back then. Still not, most days. I was jealous, angry, at everyone, but mostly at myself. I saw it then. What shame does to people, how it twists them, makes them harm what they love most." "I'm in treatment now," she said. "Depression, anxiety, the whole cocktail." There was no drama in her voice, just fatigue. "I know I hurt you. I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know I'm trying." I nodded, not out of politeness, but because I understood now what it meant to carry damage you didn't cause, but still had to live with. "Claire," she said, "your story helped me, even when I hated you for telling it." I looked at her, then reached into my bag. I pulled out the early draft of my second book. It was about forgiveness, about the shadows we pass down and the light we choose to become. "Would you help me write this?" I asked. Her eyes welled. "Me?" "Who better?" I said. She took the manuscript like it was a lifeline. Maybe it was. Weeks passed. The book took shape, and so did a new purpose. One evening, while watching clips from my TED Talk, I jotted an idea in my notes. What if we built something for kids like us? That idea became a blueprint. I launched a non-profit, Rooted Without Soil. It was a space for young people who came from emotionally absent families. We offered therapy grants, creative writing workshops, group support, and emergency housing connections. People came. Not just students, not just daughters and sons. People, bruised souls, unseen kids in adult bodies, refugees of conditional love. Every Friday, our center glowed with laughter, music, and sometimes tears. It wasn't about fixing anyone. It was about making sure no one felt broken alone. The podcast that started it all had long since become a staple in mental health discussions. But now, it reached a new milestone. A documentary team contacted me. They wanted to turn Not the Favorite Child into a docuseries. I hesitated at first, but when they showed me the vision, raw interviews, storytelling across generations, art born from pain, I said yes. Filming was intimate, exhausting, beautiful. Watching it later, I barely recognized myself in episode 1, the girl with the fragile voice, holding back tears. She looked like someone searching for a map in a room with no doors. Now she was writing the map for others. I took a time to breathe again. One morning, with coffee in hand, and the city still yawning awake, I sat at my desk and wrote a letter to myself at age 12. I didn't hold back. Dear Claire, you are not the reason they can't love right. You are not a mistake. You are not too much, too soft, too complicated. You are not broken. You are not invisible. You are not the echo of their silence. You are the start of your own voice. You are not a system failure. You are a survivor of one. I folded the letter, tucked it into my notebook, and smiled. Not because everything was perfect now, But because, finally, I no longer needed it to be, the call came on a Tuesday. I had just finished reading a student's essay titled, "Healing is a Circle." It was rough, raw, but beautiful. "Your father's condition is progressing faster than expected," the nurse said gently. "You should come soon." I hadn't spoken to them in nearly 2 years. Not after the ceremony, not after the lawsuit threats. Silence had become our mutual agreement. Still I went. The care home smelled like overcooked soup and antiseptic. I walked slowly down the corridor, past rooms with half-closed doors and lives unraveling behind them. When I stepped into his room, he was staring out the window. Thin, frail, a shell of the man who once shouted me out of his house. He didn't look at me. The nurse gave a small nod, then left us alone. I sat beside him, quietly. No monologue, no dramatic declarations, just silence. Eventually he turned to me. His eyes were cloudy but focused. For a brief second, something flickered behind them. "Do I know you?" he asked. I nodded. "You did?" He squinted. "You look like someone I used to dream about. A daughter. She was kind, brave, smarter than I ever was." My chest tightened. "Who are you?" he whispered. I reached out, gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm forgiveness," I said. His face softened. Then slowly he leaned back and fell asleep. I didn't cry. I walked out into the cold air, sat on the bench under the sycamore tree in the garden, and exhaled decades of grief I didn't know I still carried. That night I wrote in my journal, "Some ghosts don't need to be exorcised, just understood." The following semester, Harvard approved the course proposal I had submitted months ago. Family psychology and narrative writing. It was the first of its kind, a blend of memoir, therapy, and academic reflection. Not just storytelling, but story healing. Students filled the room beyond capacity. Some sat on the floor, others stood against the wall. They came not just to learn, but to feel seen. We didn't just write essays. We wrote wounds. We unpacked inherited silence, generational pressure, love with terms and conditions. One student wrote, "I thought healing would come from forgiving my parents, but it came from forgiving myself for needing their love so badly. Every week I brought in a new story. Mine, theirs, borrowed, shared. And in return, they gave me theirs. It was an exchange of honesty no syllabus could have prepared us for. Word spread. Other departments reached out, invited me to speak. Parents even attended open lectures. Some cried, some left halfway, some stayed after to apologize. To someone who wasn't even their child. I published the second book with Haley. It became a national bestseller. We didn't call it Redemption or Rise. We called it Still Here. Because that's what we were. That's what we are. Later that year, the Not the Favorite Child documentary premiered at an international film festival. It won Best Social Impact Feature. I walked the red carpet not in a designer dress, but in a navy blazer my mother once threw away, stitched back together by hand. Haley walked beside me. We held hands like survivors of the same storm. The nonprofit, Rooted Without Soil, opened 2 more chapters, one in Chicago, one in Seattle. And I kept teaching. But I also started building something quieter, a retreat, a weekend getaway for students of the course to unplug and reconnect with their words, their wounds, and each other. We found an old cabin in Vermont, surrounded by pine and mist. The first trip, 20 of us drove up in 3 vans, music blasting, energy nervous and electric. We spent the weekend writing in the woods, hiking with notebooks in our pockets, reading aloud by firelight. It wasn't therapy, but it healed. On the final day, we hiked to the clearing. At the center stood a small statue I had commissioned. It was simple. Just a child reading beneath a tree. But at the base, etched into stone, were the words, "We are not born to be loved conditionally. We are born to be." Some cried, some stood silent, but all of us, in that moment, felt rooted, even without soil. I sat on a nearby rock, watching the wind tug at pages of half-written poems, and I smiled. Not because the pain was gone, but because for the first time in my life, it had somewhere to go.